Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, today we are doing another quote-unquote undiscovered filmmaker.
Yep.
I say undiscovered. We hadn't heard of this person before our guest introduced them to them, but lots and lots of people have out there. But this might not be someone listeners necessarily know about, but hopefully by the end of the episode, they'll have heard a very, very good case as to why they should have or why they might want to, accompanied by some fascinating examples of their filmmaking.
Yes, we're doing Helen Hill, and we're doing some examples of her work in ways that I think will pull out lots of different, I was going to say threads, but that ends up being a horrible pun on one of the films in terms of, dressmaking, which we'll get onto. But I have lots of thoughts and notes and sort of things about styles of animation, silhouette and cutout, things about her kind of broader production process, links between kind of dressmaking and animation in one case, voices, boiling, flattened cutouts, aging, fragility. I'm really excited to delve into some films that I was not familiar with, but I think already I was thinking ways I could teach these films, stick them in my animation class, and the students sort of can run with them, really.
Listeners, get your fancy animation bingo drinking game cards at the ready with words like that. Sounds good. For me, I reckon we might revisit some themes we've discussed on other episodes where we've looked at things like animated documentaries and also films that deal with issues of trauma or memory through the lens of animated fantasy. And I guess my big question I want to see if I can answer next hour is sort of when they're in these films, which are often very kind of mixed media, interspacing live action with animation, what is the animation bringing? And I think there's a fantastical role of the animation coming
or what is the live action bringing?
Or that too.
He says.
Quite right. And off we go. But not just us. We have a wonderful guest who has introduced this person to us and is going to lead us through their life and work. We're joined very luckily by Karen Redrobe, who is the Elliot and Roslyn Jaffe Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She's a feminist film theorist and the author and editor of a number of books, including Animating Film Theory and Undead, in Animation, Feminisms and the Art of War, which came out with the University of California Press just this year. So do check it out. She's also currently editing a collection called Course Projections with Kartik Nair, and it's on the topic of film, freedom and pedagogy, which includes contributions from festival directors, archivists, filmmakers and scholars from around the world. We're very lucky to be joined by Karen. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm absolutely delighted.
Well, we're delighted to have been introduced to Helen Hill's work. Let's get going, I guess. Tell us let's do the short bit and then we'll do it over again over another hour is what I say in episodes like this. So give us in a few sentences, in a minute or two, who is Helen Hill? Why should we be interested in her work if we've not heard of it before? Give us the sales pitch and then we'll delve into her life a bit and work a bit more thoroughly.
Yeah, well, Helen Hill was a really, I think, unique animator, experimental, really outside of the kind of mainstream system. She distributed her own films. She was not interested in joining a kind of mainstream distribution or exhibition program. She often showed films in her house. She ran community animation projects. And she lived and breathed animation and saw it as a kind of way of life. There's a kind of vision of community that comes through her mode of making animation. She was born in Columbia, South Carolina, in the United States. She won an award at the age of 12 for her first film, The House of Sweet Magic.
Wow.
And just fell in love with filmmaking at that point. She then was admitted to Harvard and studied poetry and experimental animation. Susan Pitt was one of her main teachers and inspirations.
Makes perfect sense. Sorry.
Yes. She then did an MFA in animation at Cal Arts, moved to Nova Scotia, and was very involved in film collectives there, the Atlantic Film Cooperative, and at the Nova Scotia School College of Art and Design. She taught. She was always a teacher, but in very experimental ways.
Yeah.
And then she moved to New Orleans in 2001 with her husband, Paul Gailiunas, who was a community-based doctor. And she started with other people, the New Orleans Film Collective. They had to evacuate their home because of Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed a lot of her poetry and her films. And so but she really wanted to move back to New Orleans. And so a year later, she insisted on moving back to be part of the rebuilding of the city with her husband and their baby, Frances Pop. And tragically, she was murdered on January 4th in her 30s, 2007, by a home invader. They had a pet pig. She opened the door to let the pig out in the night, and just by chance, somebody was running away and ran into the house. And so she was shot. So her life was really cut short. And she was in the middle of making her kind of most ambitious film at that time. And, it was through that film that I became interested in her work, but then became kind of immersed in more of it.
I was going to ask how you kind of discovered her work on the back of this incredible story, and people can look online and find kind of bits and piece together. And I must admit, I was certainly doing that whilst watching the films and sort of trying to map some of the things that the films are about against her story. But how did you then discover her?
Well, I was actually at Harvard for another reason, and Hayden Guest, who's the head of the Harvard Film Archive, said to me, we just got this amazing bunch of material that we're currently digitizing by a former student, Helen Hill. And I didn't know her work, but he introduced me to it. And COVID then, I wasn't working on it for a while. COVID hit soon after that. So I was working then with what was being digitized, and actually Harvard worked with Paul Gailiunas to create a really amazing Vimeo site that is pretty complete with all of her films. So, one of the wonderful things about her work is it's very teachable because it's so accessible. Through this Vimeo site. And Hayden Guest had said to me, there might be a paper archive at some point with some really interesting materials, but then it seemed like that wouldn't happen. But the Harvard Film Archive contacted me and said, would you like to be introduced to the family? And I was like, yes, please. So they introduced me to Helen's mom, Becky Lewis, who's a really amazing person, and also to her husband, Paul Gailiunas. And I ended up going, the first trip I made after COVID lockdown was to go and stay in Helen Hill's home with her mom and stepdad, Kevin Lewis, and her brother Jake. And they allowed me to stay in Helen's bedroom. The archive was in their home, including all the dresses that are a big part of the last film she was making. And I spent a week with them, and it was the most unique experience I've ever had working on a filmmaker, because every night we sat and talked through what I'd found, talked about Helen's work. But so that was this just really magical experience. And Paul ended up shipping me more archival materials from California, where he's now based. And I just had a kind of very personal encounter with this filmmaker.
I suppose I'm interested in how you kind of saw your role as, and this use of the idea of the archival material, because at some point it was just material, just things, and for the family it's now archive, or for you as a researcher. So did you see your role as one of like recovery of Helen Hill's work? Was community driving you? Was catharsis was it finality? What was the sort of thing that was guiding you? Because obviously you're in a very unique position. When we're doing research, we don't have any of these experiences that you've just described with the material. So
I guess my question when I went into the project was framed by the incomplete volume. What does it mean to think about this film as an unfinished film? But it's also a finished film. Actually, in the Florestine Collection, Paul on the voiceover says, this, is an unfinished film that was finished by me, completed by me, so it's both finished and not finished.
And just for listeners' sake, because we haven't introduced films yet, the Florestine Collection is the last film we'll talk about today for quite obvious reasons, but it's a film this is the ambitious work you referred to.
And she was working on it for years and didn't finish it. And so it was finished as a memorial work posthumously. And I think I went in with the question of what would it mean to think about not the posthumously finished film, but about the film that Helen was trying to make before she died, and how as a researcher would one go about learning about that after a film has been finished in another direction.
That's interesting.
So that was the question going in, but then there were just so many other questions that came up including, in the academic world, we often value critical distance and that sense of objectivity and remoteness from our objects of study for the kind of objective clear-sightedness. And I do value that.
Sure.
And was thinking about that. But I could also just feel the generosity of this family in letting me in to share in such tender materials. And I found myself sitting with really important ethical questions that I had, as a researcher, had never encountered before about, what is my ethical obligation to this family, to Helen, as I'm allowed to look at this entire archive that hasn't been sorted through. It's kind of in its raw state. And so I found myself, as I was looking through things, thinking, I am glad to see some of this material, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to write about it. I don't know if this is to share with everyone. So I was really kind of sorting as I went and finding myself encountering that. And then when I was finding myself raising kind of critical or difficult questions that I was thinking about, I found myself worrying about, is it right to write about these? So we ended up having these kind of evening conversations on the sofa in the living room where we would talk about what I was finding, what I was thinking, if there were things that like difficult questions I was finding. I felt like it was important to talk to the family about those questions. And I think I want to ask this question. And I also Zoomed with Helen's husband, Paul Gailiunas, about some of those questions. And the whole family was just so generous. Paul, I remember at one point said, it's difficult to think about some of these questions, but all I know is that Helen would have wanted us to think about them. So he sanctioned a kind of really open space. And Helen's mom was just so amazing all the way through the process, really engaged and really open-minded. And I know at one point I sent her a draft of the essay that I was writing, and I said, I can't offer you like editorial control because I think that would undermine the integrity of the essay. But if there's something that's wrong or something that, is upsetting or anything like that, please let me know. And she ended up saying, I'm in a book club and I'd really like to take this draft to the book club and talk about it in my book club. Would that be okay? And I was like, I love that. And it's so like in the spirit of Gailiunas, who was so much about trying to bring all these things into local communities and opening one's home to share knowledge and make arts education really accessible, like from the ground up and affordable and those kinds of things. So it was just an amazing experience. And I'm so grateful to the family for what that enabled. And I feel like it has transformed me as a researcher, actually, partly because so much feeling, it was just such a space of, loss and to kind of sit with the family and think, what does it mean to be accountable to our filmmakers and their families and their communities and not be remote, but also to try to keep one's critical mind in play and to kind of humanize oneself as an academic and not just be a walking brain.
Okay. Yes, I'm not gonna jump the gun and jump straight into the film itself because I think we'll just need to set the scene here. So the first one we're gonna watch, or the first one we have watched, we're gonna talk about is a film called Mouseholes from 1999. So just before we start talking about Mouseholes, fill us in. So 1999. How old is Helen at this point?
Oh, I don't know what age she is at that point, but she has graduated from Harvard.
Right. Okay.
And she's moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, is working in the Atlantic Film Co-op.
Fine. Okay.
So she's kind of postgraduate. She started teaching, so early career.
And remind me, was it at Harvard that she got introduced to animation? Or no, she was right from an early age, right? A 12-year-old award.
Yeah, her mom was initially a teacher. Her mom had gone back to do a PhD in women's studies after Helen left for college.
Okay.
But before that, she was, I think, a K through 12 teacher, K through 8 teacher maybe, and had got a grant with some other teachers from Kodak for this project to bring cameras into schools to teach. So I found her mom's diaries in Helen's archive of this filmmaking process. And through that and through another kind of community-based education project that was in Columbia, South Carolina, Helen had learned to make this film, The House of Sweet Magic, that had stop motion animation in it. And that was the first time she'd kind of been introduced to it. But then as a child, she'd also traveled, I think, to Dundee with her stepdad, and had encountered some British animation at that time and became really fascinated with animation through her location in the UK. So British animation was really important to her kind of formation. But then it was really at Harvard where she had that kind of systematic training with Susan Pitt and others.
And what then, she's sporadically or consistently maybe making animations since then? Or
Yes.
is this right
Yes,
time?
this,
Just
like,
then she has
and
time?
just short, and she describes when you hear kind of so for example, with the film we're going to talk about later, the Florestine Collection, there are audio tapes of interviews she does with people, and when she's introducing herself to people, she says, I'm an experimental animator, I make short films about all kinds of different things, and but that was her full-time identity, was as an experimental animator, and really with an investment in making, she felt that filmmaking was a right, that everybody has the right to make films, and that it's very doable. And a lot of her work is about either teaching people to do that in a very kind of accessible, low budget way, or making, like, one of the films we're going to talk about is a kind of almost like a manifesto to get everybody to make their own films, their own animated films. So, that's who she was. Like, I think already, like, by the time she went to Harvard, she was a poet and an animator.
I'm depressing myself by some of the questions that are popping into my head, but because they are popping into the head, I feel like it might be popping into the head of the listener as well. So to ask them quite boring questions, this is not her, it's her full-time identity, but it's not her full-time, she's not making money out of this, or is she?
She's teaching.
She's teaching, she's doing
in
this.
kind of, part-time ways. But I would say Helen seemed to be, and Paul, they seemed to be able to live on nothing. They were, I think, utopian. And Paul described, when I interviewed him, the world that they created as like a utopian world. So they were involved in kind of barter systems, in all kinds of food banks, and really idealistic alternative community visions. They were involved with punk, anarchism, so very interesting, like they were creating a different way of living wherever they went, and they sought out those people, and the animation reflects that. It's part of a utopian vision.
So why did they move to Nova Scotia, which is where this film was made?
Paul is Canadian.
Okay.
And he got his medical, I think I don't know if he went to finish his medical degree or residency, but it was linked to his medical training and first job, I think, that they went there. But there's also the Atlantic Filmmakers Co-op. So there's a really great independent animation community there. And I think they were like so happy. And I think that experience of a collective was very important in Halifax, in terms of moving from the kind of Harvard training situation. I think Harvard was a very strange experience for Helen. I think she loved it, but I found a cartoon that one of her friends had done of her, and it was like Helen at Harvard. And so there's this image of this animator, but she's surrounded by all these signs of the South. I think moving from the South up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a strange experience, and an estranging experience. And so she would create these worlds around her, like Tyre Miles, the historian, told me that as her roommate, Helen would do these things with Paul and another close friend. They would do things like set up a tent in the middle of the dorm room and live in it for a while, or all dress up in kind of really weird outfits and just wear them everywhere. So there's a lot of dressing up, a kind of pantomime aesthetic of rejecting a kind of capitalist conformist way of living and just inhabiting the world differently. So Paul was very invested in affordable healthcare. He helped with the films, and that they were involved in some of the activist communities, and making food accessible. They just shared food all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but this obviously experimental animation seems the perfect home for all of the things that you described. And I was particularly struck by when you said the kind of doable nature, which we will talk about the films in more detail and the kind of aesthetics, but the kind of the do-it-yourself, all the ways that we would encourage, or I would encourage students to think about experimental animation, the way that scholars have defined the kind of qualities of experimental animation, which sort of some way seems counterintuitive as to what experimental animation does, but all the things that you described around, the kind of doability, the world, you said that the worlds that animation can access, these all seem very well suited to the kind of interpretive form that people associate experimental animation with. And you were saying that kind of the mixing of media, the collage, all my notes are about, it's sort of a bit cut out here and it's a bit Reiniger, and then it's found footagey and direct animation and scratching on the set, and this is, I'm just really struck.
Lotte Reiniger was very, very important.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to say about her.
Yeah.
It was, I would say, one of her main inspirations. So silhouette cutouts was profoundly important to her films, even though she uses a lot of color.
Yes.
It keeps coming back. And through many of her films, you'll notice there's teapots and teacups. And she loved having tea parties. It was one of the ways that she brought people into her home. And she would do things like the equivalent of sewing bees or sewing circles, but film bees, where she'd be like, we're having a film bee, come over, we'll brainstorm how to make a film, we'll develop it in the bath, we'll do all these kinds of things.
So it's a halfway house between, it's a bit of kind of Pitt's asparagus, surrealism, with a bit of Reiniger and the intricacy of some of this.
But the story of her life are telling us so far seems a bit like that. It's like, okay, let's move to Nova Scotia. He's got a new job. The things are there. I don't really like Cambridge that much. And also there's this amazing artistic sense, that fusion of the kind of the imaginary, or imaginary in the kind of true sense of the word, like the fantastical nature of life, the desire to feed the imagination, creativity, alongside slightly more annoyingly pragmatic decisions like how are we going to afford it and all this kind of stuff. They're all mixed together in this kind of bubble of life.
Yeah, but I feel there was an absolute commitment to the fantastical and the fantastic in life, like the fantastic possibilities of community, the fantastic possibilities of what's in our own minds and how we could share that with each other and what the quality of life could be in that way. And she was clearly, like, I talked to many of her friends, she was so clearly like absolutely beloved and just such a kind of open heart, and you just like reading through, like I read through all of her diaries and letters and notebooks planning the different films, and it's like her mind is completely open in that way to the possibilities of creation and those pragmatic things that hold people back, and like, well, I have to make, I have to settle down, I have to have a house, I have to do this. She just believed it, that these things would show up and that you actually didn't need that much, and that you'd be much happier if you just let it go. So there's a calendar that she made for her mom that I saw that has all these different diagrams. One of them's in the book Undead. And, one of her questions was like, what will film be in the 21st century? She kind of lived into the beginning of the 21st century. But there are kind of layers in that. There's a layered world, and the top layer is her utopian vision of it, where there are things like, all the things that we don't need except coffee will be replaced by, and film development will be free, and healthcare will be free, and there'll just be free flowing coffee, and our time will be able to be spent on these creative enterprises. And then in the kind of underground part of this kind of vision of the 21st century, there are these bunkers that you have to hide in that are bomb-proof, and that will be the only place where you'll be able to make your films, because everything else will have been commodified and rendered by capital.
Yes.
And she was always, I think, inhabiting spaces in a way that I think she's very interested in performance as well, even though there's not a lot of live action performance in her works, in her life. There was a kind of performance element that was almost circus-like, with the costumes and found objects and making, like hats and all this kind of things, like strange socks. And she just like loved to kind of play at ways that kind of refused to conform, and showed you can live life however you want. And there was a kind of commitment to that freedom of living and a rejection of that mandate of you should do this.
Yeah.
That is very, I find, especially at the moment, my goodness, very moving and inspiring.
Yeah.
That's probably quite enough scene setting now.
Well, it does link in with the first film.
Yeah, do you want to give us what is Mouseholes? Another impossible question. What is Mouseholes?
Yes.
Yeah, so Mouseholes is a 16mm film. It's mixed media animation. It's about 8 minutes long.
Yeah.
And it begins in a way that I think is so inviting. She begins with this line, "Since I could not stop my grandfather's death, I have tried to understand through recordings of his voice, home movies, and animated scenes of heaven."
Yeah.
Which gives you the sense of the scope within 8 minutes. It's, from, death to heaven.
Yeah.
And as you said, the media modes are very fragile. So she'll combine, like sometimes there is pencil line drawings, kind of line animation. Sometimes there is, paper puppets, and they might be, have things like pipe cleaners or little bits of wood, or like it looks like lollipop sticks.
Yes, yeah.
These very ordinary materials. And there's nothing kind of, I would say, artistic, or kind of high art in the depictions of the grandfather. It's almost like a stick figure. And the scene for most of the film is the grandfather's hospital bed as he's dying, with another similar kind of paper puppet of Helen as a kind of child at his bedside. And I think that framing of since I could not stop my grandfather's death tells you something about Helen. She was, on the one hand, playful and fantastical, and on the other hand, resolute. That as a child, there's a sense of a child who's ready to take on death, and had been contemplating it. And there's a line later in the film where she says something like, "Before we lost him, I was working on a plan to bring him back." So there's a sense on the one hand of this delicacy of people at the brink of death, and the fragility of those around them who love them, that is rendered in paper, and the fragility of paper. And on the other hand, a sense of the kind of power of love that is able to take on death. And somehow, what I love about her animation is it combines that force of the human spirit with the delicacy of human fragility. And it's just amazing how that, she says, there are these things, like you mentioned documentary as some animated documentary as something that we might think about here. In some ways, you could think about this as a documentary of a death. Because there are these I think Helen had quite recently got a tape recorder as her grandfather is dying. And so she takes the tape recorder to the hospital, and on the soundtrack, you hear her grandfather's voice kind of in the very short time before he died.
It's wavering.
It's really wavering, and she describes him as being in a delirium. So he had worked on train lines, and he thinks that he might be working the trains at some point, and that becomes part of the scene where there are these kind of, I think they're paper train tunnels. Like there's a kind of very simply fabricated train tunnel, and then she starts to in the film she is thinking about her grandfather's dying as a shrinking, and so animation's ability to play with scale is really activated as a way of visually manifesting death or dying, the process of dying. So you see this puppet shrinking and doing these kind of little somersaults, almost becoming a kind of fetus figure. And eventually the grandfather turns into a mouse. And it's almost like a reincarnation, and that mouse is running through the train tunnels. So there's a sense of the kind of fantasy of where do people go when they die? And so there's a kind of poetic logic there. And early in the film, she talks about her grandfather having a hornet's nest in his house. And I actually saw that hornet's nest because it's now in Becky's living room. So it's this kind of giant paper hornet's nest. And these animated hornets she uses color, like painted animation for that. They spell out the film's title of Mouseholes. And on the voiceover, she says, maybe it was the hornet's nest. I don't know how he got the hornets out. And now something has gotten into his kidneys. So there's this kind of easy move in her imagination from the problem of how to get hornets out of a nest so you can hang it in your living room to something that's not seeable having gotten into his kidneys and causing this shrinking. So it's a very fantastical depiction of the logic of the causation and logic of dying.
Yeah.
And that dying is this shrinking. And this is going on with the kind of tape recording of the grandfather. But then there are also some kind of home movies of Helen and her brother Jake as kids with the grandfather. You hear some of the grandfather's favorite records. You see photos of him when he was a child. And then you also hear this like beautiful eulogy that is her brother, as I don't know how old her brother was when the grandfather died, but it's from the funeral. So she must have taken her tape recorder to the funeral to record her brother talking about Pop and what he would play with them and the wild things that he would do with them. And while that recording is going on, Helen does a beautiful animation of the stained glass windows in the church, and you see a kind of animated figure of the pastor. And then you see the puppet of Helen doing I think she's doing somersaults or something in front of the stained glass window. But there's this sense of Helen meeting her grandfather in that middle space in this kind of transitional time. And it's as if the person who's dying and the animator have a special ability to hover between life and death, and that the animator has something special to contribute to our understanding of what it means to pass between these states.
That was a superb job of unpacking a film that I'm still processing, and I'm going to do a very bad job as a follow up to that. But the way I'm trying to come at this and make some sense out of it is by thinking of it as a documentary.
Yes,
and I'm sort of thinking, because we've done a couple of animated documentaries on the pod before. I mean, the two that jump out to me because they're kind of a piece was Waltz of Bashir and Flea.
Yep.
And with both of those, I'd have to listen back to exactly what I said, but I remember being a little bit uneasy or a little bit grumpy about the kind of the way both of those films align animation with the fantastic in those films, in that both of them seem to offer animation as a kind of way of visualizing subjective trauma or subjective fantasy. And then both of them end with this kind of
the reality check.
The reality check, exactly, the reality check, which I think you were a little bit uneasy about because it kind of suggests that animation has a limitation as to how much it can represent reality. And I have an uneasiness about because it seems to suggest that this reality check has no element of fantasy. Well, actually,
yes,
fantasy is everywhere.
Those things are true, yes.
Yeah, neither of those things are true.
No.
And I didn't feel that with this.
Yes.
At all. I don't know what I did feel, which is what I'm hoping I might get out of this conversation. But there's definitely a sense that if the animation is aligned with a kind of impulse of the fantastic, it is part of the process of Helen trying to document something.
Exactly.
It's not, given the kind of legacy of animating documentary, it's not, oh, we couldn't document this, so we're going to have to use animation. And it's not, this thing is undocumentable, so therefore we have to use fantasy to kind of visualize it. It's I'm documenting something here, and the fantasy is she could have recorded her grandfather visually. She could have used that footage. She chooses to use the audio only and use these kind of, I want to back to use the word embellishment, but even that's not the right word. Yeah.
And, she doesn't say, it was as if when my grandfather was getting sick, it was as if he was shrinking.
Yeah.
She says, my grandfather grows smaller with each hour.
Yes.
And then you see the mouse at the table and it shrinks and disappears. And she talks about him shrinking away from his pillow as he sleeps. And you see this paper puppet. And then she's like, and soon his arms are growing shorter and shorter, So there's this sense like she is describing what is happening, and it's real, and there's not a sense of this is a metaphor. This is a sense of this is what I'm experiencing of my grandfather's dying, and I have the capacity to share that with you. And there's something about the experiences that feel isolating, that she uses animation to allow us to experience in a kind of community that I think is core to understanding her work. And I know, this book that I just finished, Undead, Into in Animation, Feminisms and the Art of War, is very much about animation that appears as a kind of rupturing alternative in other contexts, whether it be within the middle of an art installation or a performance or a live action film. And because of that kind of intermittent animation, people kept saying to me, you should write about Waltz with Bashir, or you should write about Flea. And I did do a conversation about Flea, but I didn't want to write about either of them for exactly the reason you described. And I did want to write about Helen Hill for how it differed from those things, that there is a sense of lived experience that is beyond the modes of realism that often are accepted as the only way to mediate reality. She expands, I think, what counts as reality.
Yes, I think I'm struck by.
On board.
I've been on board. I bought my ticket a long time ago. But you said that it's not as if he was shrinking. It's not that one is more fantastical or more fictional than the other. One of my students this year said they sort of cancel each other and flatten each other, and that it's all images and it's all
maybe challenges
you said modes of reality, I think is what
polarization of those terms of fantasy and reality. And I think there is certainly creative productivity in the way that Helen Hill mediates the world. But I think she does it in a way that on the one hand differs. Like there is certainly, I think, when you're watching that film, a sense when she says, well, my grandfather was shrinking every hour, you're like, and there's some part that questions it, but I think the world making is so emotionally convincing and so emotionally authentic that it makes you ultimately question whether we are perceiving the world right. Or whether we're misperceiving the world and we're missing things that she is noticing, bringing to our attention.
Because he is, those of us who've I'm sure everyone's gone through a process of saying goodbye to a loved one, and they are shrinking. They might not be shrinking in a kind of biological, well, in a way they kind of are too, but that might not be what she means by that word, but that doesn't mean that what she's saying needs to be a metaphor for something, or that it's metaphorized through that image. It's that image is for want of a better word, an index to what she's talking about.
Yes, something very concrete about Helen Hill's fantasy, something very material.
And I would say sincere. I wrote sincere. I feel like the film is very sincere about what people become. The film is about what people become lost to. And this, it's the classic fantasy and fictional world. It's not about what people are escaping from. It's let's talk about what they're escaping into. And I love all the stuff. Do you know where you are right now? Anywhere. And so this idea of animation, I wrote animation allows sincerity, and I felt that this was a very sincere film. I think that's how I.
And I think when we think about fantasy, or even the phrase like "it was as if," there's a sense of this imagination of a thing that isn't reality. But there's a moment in the funeral where she says the pastor was certain that my grandfather, was in heaven. So I thought about what I could not imagine. So I also think one of the things that's interesting about this film is that she marks the limits of the imagination, and the sense of a child's hearing something about the explanation, like a religious explanation of what happens at the time of death, and that she hits some kind of wall. And so she's like, she says, I was thinking about what I could not imagine. And then you start seeing these kind of wax crayon scratches and, scratching away the black and the color underneath. And she starts animating that. And then you see the grandfather floating through the clouds and the pink and purple tea party. And there's a music box. And there's a sense that these are not marking a fantasy of heaven, but marking the impossibility of imagining that. So all these other things come and hold that place. So it's something about
But it's about declaring the kind of the mediated quality of any of this stuff. So like, not to get like too psychoanalytical, or you could get philosophical, but almost every critical framework to describe the imagination kind of ends with this kind of noble truth kind of out of the Buddha, which is that like the idea that fantasy, to find reality, you need to remove all the fantasy, is to misunderstand what reality is. Reality is a mediated experience of the unfathomableness of existence. So fantasy modes of meaning making are, in my opinion, almost more honest or more authentic than realist ones, because the only difference, because both of them are a mediated fantastical construction in order to create meaning. The only difference is one of them is telling you that it is, and the other one is desperately trying to pretend it isn't. So fantasy is the honest one. It's the one saying, I am just one person telling this story. I have limits. There are impossibilities that I can see and feel, and I need to evoke that as part of this story, rather than attempt to kind of, this is the story of my granddad's death.
And for somebody with such a kind of ebullient imagination as Helen Hill had from the get-go, to say this was something I could not imagine. And there's so much imagery about heaven, but there's also a kind of refusal of that at that moment to say, none of this is working for me. When the pastor is talking about heaven, I can't imagine it. I've hit a wall because of this loss, and so it's then a moment to where the animation really takes off in so many different forms with the color and the painting and the cutouts and things like that. There's a sense of a kind of proliferation of making, I think.
Is the animation enough though? Like, is the animation is that the other side of the? Because she's hit a wall, so she turns to animation, or is there the sense that, because everyone talks about animation as this creative, it still feels that animation is implicated in, even the animation's not quite enough.
I think the animation is marking the line of that limit. I don't think it is able to supplement for that absence. I think it's saying we can make this, we can make this, we can make this. We've got teapots, we've got clouds, we've got color.
And just got distorted, grainy footage at times, right? It's just sort of stock, film stock being kind of played with, like nothing's even being represented, like in these moments.
And then when she, this is kind of the moment where, like that moment of the funeral is where the grandfather really emerges as the paper mouse, is coming and going, and she thinks about, I guess there's also a real mouse, right? There's a footage of a real mouse, and it's coming out of that train tunnel. And then she says that he could return to everything, even his favorite tie drawer. And that's when you see this kind of grainy footage of all these rolled up ties in the drawer with a little animated mouse kind of running through it. And a sense like, oh, there's the grandfather. But there's a sense that the film is creating these different kind of scenarios, having told us that he's kind of shrunk away.
I could absolutely keep going, but we're rocketing through our time.
Loath to
so maybe we can just continue this conversation into the next example. So do you want to tell us, because this is a couple of years later, but in a similar time period, what are we looking at now?
So 2 years later, 2001 is when the film comes out, but I would say it's really a millennial film. Like, it's a film about the new millennium. Madam Winger makes a film. It was made at the Atlantic Film Co-op, or started there, and it was finished in New Orleans. So it's kind of a bridge film between these kind of eras of her filmmaking. And it is a film that is in partnership with a book that Helen created called Recipes for Disaster that you can find online. I think it's a really interesting book where I think she sends out postcards. She did all kinds of like mail art and things like that as well. But she asked 37 experimental animators for advice on how to make films in an affordable way, and they all sent information. And this becomes the content of this recipe book with all these different instructions from filmmakers. But it also becomes a kind of inspiration for this film. And I think it's her aunt or godmother, Meredith Pogue, who plays Madame Winger. And she's a very kind of posh character with a big kind of bouffant hairdo, like very colorful. And it's described as a survival guide for the 21st century. And Madame Winger wants you to make a film about something you love. And show you her favorite low-budget filmmaking techniques. And it includes like cameraless animation. Like, you don't even need a camera. You know, you don't need. You can develop things in your own bathtub. And it's done almost like a public service announcement, and takes you through this kind of dystopian vision of a 21st century that is completely capitalist, weapon-saturated, warmongering, and gives you a kind of alternative to that. There's a kind of disclaimer at the beginning from her kind of vegetarian vegan perspective. It's like, unfortunately, the celluloid film contains gelatin. You see a picture of Helen's pet pig. But there's a sense of like, one day we'll get past that.
A vegetarian film,
And then it takes you through all these things about how to make a film without keeping up with the latest tech. You can hand scratch, you can do color baths. It doesn't talk a lot about sound, but it gives a kind of aside and says, making your own music is a great way to deal with the cost of getting licenses for music. It talks about Super 8. It talks about 35 millimeter, 60 millimeter. It talks about working with found film, flip books, all the different cameras. It kind of shows you the Bolex. It shows you how to load a film, all in animated form as this kind of well, there's some live action footage there too. But it is really a kind of call to not arms, but filmmaking as a thing that everybody can do. It's really, I think there's a real kind of manifesto for the democratization of filmmaking as a practice.
And this, you said it's very millennial, because the thing that obviously struck me is I mean, going through all of the things that you just said, all the different ways that it mentions direct animation and motion as an optical illusion, flipbooks and scratch animation, and in this kind of kaleidoscope of different types of camera and film stock and the chemicals to use and the timings. And then at the very end, it says this is not fancy technology and the changing digital technology, and filmmaking is fun, so get going. So it's kind of 2001-ness is really important, because it's 15, well, slightly longer, but digital technology, because you'd say that you make the case that digital technology is the thing that democratizes. You now can have a phone, go out and do this. But obviously in 2001, the impetus behind this film is that we're on the cusp of
change.
And it's trying to kind of capture, it's trying to do its own recovery of film.
And I do think that Helen really foresaw the commercial, that she could see the utopian discourse around the digital, but she could also see that mandate to keep updating, to keep getting the newest software, to keep purchasing to having to keep replace things. And she could see what I think after a kind of utopian moment of digitization, a lot of film archivists,
of course,
kind of came to see as a position of, the durability of celluloid and the sense of stability in a way. But at this, there's also, I think, in addition to being invested in that kind of affordability and stability of a kind of old medium at that moment, she's not precious about celluloid. So she's like, you can just bleach the picture off. You can, so there's, while she's in Halifax, she's running these workshops, and in my book, I have one of the flyers that she made, and the title of the workshop or the flyer, there's a big banner that says, let this happen to your film. And there's a strip of film with, repeated faces of a little boy. Like the face is scratched off and drawn on and bleached off. And it's kind of violent, like what is being done to this little boy's face. But it's also like, just come and like wreck it. And,
Get going.
when I was thinking about the incomplete film, the unfinished film, one of the conclusions I came to in relation to Helen Hill's view of filmmaking is that every film is an unfinished film, partly because somebody might come and erase what you did, bleach it off and start again, or scratch all over it. So there is a sense that any film is kind of up for grabs, like any strip could be made into something else. And so there's a sense of, I think, both the stability of the technology and what that means for access and affordability, and a sense of one's power to create transformation as a very ordinary person within that fixed thing. And I think there's a real vision of society just within that sense of the medium. And that she's exploring that through these kind of parties that she would have, these film bees, where she would invite people to her home, and she'd have cakes, and she'd say, I'll, bring this box of film, we'll develop, we'll process it in my bathtub, we'll project work in progress, we'll talk about it, we'll give each other feedback, and then we'll keep working on it. And there's something so kind of extraordinary and ordinary about her commitment to doing that, in Nova Scotia, in the middle of New Orleans, just in her neighborhood, opening the doors, bringing people in, and really not wanting to think about like distribution and kind of making a name for herself. It was really about building those relationships, building community, and thinking about what is a community that has filmmaking at its center, not as a peripheral thing or something you do in your spare time, but as a way of being together in a kind of fundamental sense.
One of our kind of cliche catchphrases on the podcast is, it's actually about animation, which we've tried to stop saying because, funnily enough, you can do that with a lot of things. But I think this might be the first one I've watched, which isn't necessarily about animation, but about film. It's an animation, largely animated, about celluloid,
an instructional video,
like
an instructional film,
and how to. So I just wondered if that's an interesting kind of paradox or tension, or
using one medium to describe another.
And like, it's not this what you're describing here. It's trying to explain to people how to make films with a capital F rather than make animations.
Frame and
And I don't think that she made such a sharp distinction. I mean, she described herself as an animator often, but in this film, she moves quite easily between like hand scratching, drawing on the strip, and shooting films. And it's really about the whole gamut, I think, of filmmaking, and animation would be included in that. But it's really interesting, I think, that she chooses to make this animated instructional film.
Is she riffing on like kind of, like instructional videos more broadly?
I think so. Yeah. And I think there's a sense that those films are often industrial films, and so she's doing it for the DIY community. And kind of making it, like a textbook, and one of the amazing things in her archive, and I really hope that Harvard, which has her films, takes up the paper archive, because the materials are amazing. Like, she has all of the syllabi of classes that she took, and some of those syllabi are amazing, of like how she learned and what she combined and put together. But one of the things that I loved seeing was her own kind of teaching materials, which include all these like handouts for how she taught animation. And you just get a sense of what her view of filmmaking was. And it was very fluid, I think, in terms of, like she wanted people to do with the camera what they want it to do.
Yeah, much like she's doing.
It's like, so I think the rules are very fluid.
Okay, interesting. I'm just aware of time, but do you want any more?
No. Well, I'm again. I think we're back to, you talked about durability and stability, and therefore I'm back to fragility and kind of obsolescence. And it's not, the film is not a cautionary tale about the arrival of the digital in the strongest sense, but I hate the word, it's meditating, but it's sort of reflecting on transformation, or it's aware that, as you say, she's aware and cognizant of the potential narratives that could be embodied by the digital, and is sort of not necessarily saying one will be replaced by the other, but there's kind of space for both, or it's going to be a juggling act, and it's going to be a precarious relation, but or a fragile relationship. But as I said, filmmaking is fun.
Yeah.
Get going. So
Yes, I think that's right. And I love that actually about her spirit is that her mode of kind of film activism is not dwelling on the apocalyptic.
No.
She's not very invested, I think, in spending a lot of energy on demonizing the digital.
No.
She is interested in celebrating the thing that she loves and has found this joy in and found community in, and sees very accessible possibilities in that aren't really there. Like, she lived, without earning money. And there was something about the availability of films, like in New Orleans, at one moment, the co-op that she's with there, they find an entire shopping cart full of found films. It's just full, and so they're doing, like, all the filmmakers are doing things with these found films, so that there are these kind of ways around, like, not having any money to make the films, and like once you have the equipment, or you have a collective space where everybody can share the equipment. And the affordability of this is really there, and it just becomes about that kind of celebration. So it's not a kind of demonization. It's not anti-technological in that way. And in her journals, there is a kind of musing of like what might be possible with the digital. And as after Katrina, her films are so damaged by water damage, and some of them are destroyed. And she works with Dan Scheible and NYU, and I guess she meets them at Flaherty, I think, that was in South Carolina.
I'm right,
And I don't know a lot about the preservation process, but I'm assuming that there were digital components to, and then, now the legacy and the accessibility of her films is thanks to their digitization and their availability through Vimeo, that really is a gift, I think, to anyone who wants to see them and enjoy them. And they're just, there's all the home movies are up there that she worked with, and all kinds of film experiments. Her film from when she was 12 is up there, It's just like everything there. So the digital has become, I think, a really important part of Helen Hill's film legacy.
Yeah, well, now we can see these films and ultimately see the last what? So 2011.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've got two films to talk about here, I guess, haven't we? Talking about lost films. We've got the Florestine Collection that Chris and I have watched, and this is finished by her husband.
Yes.
Is that right? And then there's the film that
was finished,
that hopefully you got as close an access to as possible looking through some of this archive. So I mean, we've talked a lot about really fun things and playful stuff. We're gonna have to talk a lot about obviously less fun stuff now as we talk about her tragic demise. But do you want to just
tell you a little bit about that?
Yeah.
So I mean, I will say, so the Florestine Collection is this amazing, again, mixed media film. There is live action footage in there, home movies, there is stop motion animation, there is I'm trying to think of all the different kinds of, there's but the story of how this film started was, it was Mardi Gras Day, I think in 2001. I think I'm right about that. And she was walking down the street and she sees this pile of dresses, and she talks about it as 100 dresses. So it's very kind of fairy tale like, but it's a huge pile of handmade dresses that had been put out on a trash pile. And the opening of the Florestine Collection shows this in silhouette animation, that Paul and Helen stopping the car and her being like, oh my gosh, I have to take some of these. And she ends up going back and taking all of the dresses. And she hand washes them multiple times because they're filthy. And, I've now kind of looked at all the dresses that were still in Becky Lewis's possession. And Helen, kind of restored them all and hung them with footage in the film of them all on the washing.
Yeah, that's where it ends, isn't it? Is that how the film
Yes.
ends? Yeah, on the lines.
And she decides she has to find out who made these films, who made these dresses, and that she felt a real kinship with the person who had made these dresses because they clearly loved color, they clearly loved the handmade, and really treasured that process of DIY. And she wanted to explore that relationship between the DIY of the dressmaker and the DIY of her own filmmaking. And I think when the film started, it was a shared vision of the world. So she finds some leaflets in among the dresses and pursues those, and they kind of lead her to a local Baptist church, and she finds out that these dresses had been made by an elderly African-American deaconess called Florestine Collection, who had, I can't remember exactly how old she was when she died, but nearly 100 when she died. And these dresses had been put out on the street after her death. And so Helen, wants to make this film about Florestine and her creative process and what role dressmaking played in her kind of life. So she takes her tape recorder on, I think, February 13th, 2005 to Florestine's church, interviews all of Florestine's friends and her pastor and her nephew about like these, really focusing on the dresses and what they were. Did they remember them? What Florestine's spirit was like? But when Hurricane Katrina happens, Helen moved back to Columbia, South Carolina. She describes herself and her family as being in exile from New Orleans, and all she wanted to do was go back. But she saw she got a different understanding of New Orleans at the moment, and the script plans and film diaries for this film that she was working on for such a long time, they start to shift as she realizes that she and her family were able to get out and so many people weren't. And she starts to understand the racial inequities of the city in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think I started to become very interested. And this was kind of one of the things that the archival work shifted for me. She, I think, is more troubled by that sense of identification with Florestine and realizes maybe the handmaid isn't always the same thing, and that there was a kind of choosing of a life without money and a life without a job and an income in order to create a kind of utopian reality that Helen Hill was able to pursue through her art making, and that was maybe different from the world that Florestine was inhabiting. And so she decides that she's going to go back to the church and re-interview people. And she's going to look at the racial politics of the city and the history of the city more. And she starts making, she has a globe with a kind of like a black and white segregated map. And she's really reflecting on a kind of different view that isn't quite, she was in love with New Orleans and saw it, I think, rightly as a place where outcasts from the South could go and find a home. And there was this kind of culture of performance and experimentation that was really part of the city. And she loved all that about it. But I think she started to understand that in a different way. And she started to understand the poverty of the city and the even though she was kind of living in the midst of a very poor community, she did have the agency to get out and somewhere to go in a way that other people didn't. And so she was starting to kind of redirect that, the way the film might go. But I think necessarily when she died in the middle, like soon after returning to New Orleans, and Paul, who's a doctor, worked very closely with all of her experimental filmmaker friends and is, I think, very true to all of the notes that he found about what Helen wanted to do with the film. But he necessarily had to acknowledge within the film that he was finishing it and that her life had been interrupted. And I think the film's emphasis shifts to being more about her than it would have been. And that loss and sadness becomes profound. And because Florestine had recently died when Helen found the films, there is this sense of two deaths in the film, and that the connection between them then is also around a kind of posthumous creative reflection. So it becomes a different kind of film.
Yeah.
No, there's, I mean, the kind of the way that I've got, of time is obviously very. There's the fragility of life versus the labor of animation. Animation is this very laborious and time-consuming process versus the voiceover. It was over in an instant. So you have and at one point the voiceover says an incomplete film, an incomplete life. And so I suppose it's and the fault and the confusion of time, because I think at one point he says she continued to work on this film. So there's this kind of complex arrangement of time where there's an acknowledgement that she went from the filmmaker to the sort of subject of the film in an instant.
Yes, in an instant.
And that really complex kind of shifting. But it also reminded, the way that you described her work in relation to Florestine herself, it's sort of, I hope the comparison isn't too crass, but in some ways it marries your work on Helen Hill, because you're sort of coming into a life that has been cut short and trying to make sense of it and trying to...
Like, how do you put these pieces together?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so the way that you described Helen Hill's sort of navigating, and I've put the mystery of the dressmaker, it's not a million miles away from what you would then have to have done to sort of intervene into a life cut short. So I found those kind of parallels quite interesting.
Yes, and I found myself really grappling as a scholar with a kind of mimesis that was happening within that space of the home, and being, kind of in Helen's room and in the midst of this very personal archive with the dresses in a way that she had been with the dresses, and, touching all of the dresses and kind of studying them and really trying to work out what was Helen doing and what am I doing and what are the differences. So, for example, at a certain point, the question, Helen's research into Florestine's life and history was something I started to wonder. Like, I started to kind of pursue some of the things that she was pursuing and that got cut short. And then I thought that wasn't what this project was about. And I think that was her project. And I think it's important not to confuse those two, although I think the question of Florestine Kinch's life is really fascinating and, a wonderful project to explore. And some of the kind of like birth papers and kind of government official documents will have become available since I started working on this. So I think there's kind of new things to be found out about Florestine, but it felt to me like that wasn't my project, and I did feel in the middle of this project that it was important to distinguish what I was trying to think about and what she was trying to think about.
I mean, we can go through the film. We could go through the film, I should say. There's lots of things that I, would love to tease out in terms of the aesthetics of it. As you say, there's loads of different... I watched this one first, actually, of the three you sent us, and sort of went in it quite cold, and it was a useful introduction to her life, obviously. But I was like, okay, so I haven't really seen any of her films yet. Let's see what the other two are like. And I was relieved to see a huge amount of consistency in kind of style and tone and things like that. Obviously, how much we can find, how much I'm finding in that and how much is just there is just going to have to be an open question. But I certainly felt Helen's work was in that the Florestine Collection.
Definitely. There's definitely, and there's things like she had a residency at I think it was at Cal Arts in the middle of the the time that she was working on this film. And there are some beautiful photographs of her, with all the kind of, with a kind of light table and looking at all the different pieces of fabric. And one of the things that you see from that is that she is remaking the dresses into filmic form. So she's actually cutting them up into pieces, and there's some really beautiful, like rapid stop motion work of using the different patterns that are kind of bringing the patterns of the fabric to life in a way that is quite abstract and quite different from like a biopic. And it's things like that that I think she was, and she's also got this found footage from the New Orleans kind of shopping cart, and she's scratching on that and kind of drawing things into that found footage of like flowers and things that are taken from the dress patterns, and she's moving them onto the found film. So there is something like a translation process of what would it mean to translate the liveliness and joy of these dresses into animated filmic form that I think was part of her process that is not part of the memorial film. I mean, the traces of that are there,
Sure.
but I don't think that is what then Paul and Helen's friends are trying to do as they finish the film. But I think that was where one of the things that she was trying to do was translate.
Into the
Yeah.
It's also these songs or sort of the key.
And Paul is in a folk group.
Right. Okay. Right. Fine.
So he's often on the soundtrack, and I think sometimes Helen's voice is in there. I feel like I recognize it, but I think the band is called Piggy.
Okay.
And so there are these, the voiceover narration is often done in song form about their life together and what they explored and what she was like and the different things they saw in New Orleans. It's kind of sonic love letter to the city and to Helen.
Yeah. Is it the last line? I tried to write it down as quickly as I could. Frayed remains stitched together with love.
Yes.
What's said at the end. And
Yes.
Yeah. That could probably describe all of three of the movies that we studied today in many ways.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a fitting end.
Yeah, it does talk about, he says, she cared so much about the dresses and for this neglected ruined city, which she wanted to help brighten with her love and creativity. Now I want to resurrect her, to mend her wounds, to take care of her, but I can't. And I think I think she was working out what she could and couldn't do in relation to Florestine and her community, and that her understanding of that relationship and her relationship to the city was in process when she died. But I think Paul does recognize the limits of what he can do, both as a filmmaker and in the wake of Helen's death. And I think there's something very beautiful about that acknowledgement of both the finishing and the necessarily incomplete. This film really raises, for me, especially when we think about it in relation to Mouseholes, which Helen thought was that when she was doing her grant applications for the Florestine Collection, she saw it as the film that was closest to what she wanted to do in the Florestine Collection. The question of what a complete life would be, like, are all our lives incomplete because we have to die? But there is a real difference, I think, in the mediation of that moment of death between the shrinking and that process of being able to kind of talk and record and imagine, and that suddenness of a shift from living to dead that comes with the murder. It's very different, and I think the films reflect that.
I mean, terrific. I mean, incompleteness is what I feel about what we've just discussed, in the sense that we could go on and on and on, but time is limited, and hopefully that will at least do its job of giving listeners a snapshot of Helen's work and life, and maybe encourage them to check out the Vimeo account.
I hope you do. I think
if you
it's
do
so
that,
good.
listeners, then fine.
But also, as you described so wonderfully, like the sort of the research process that surrounds everything. That, because you also mentioned, obviously this is a project that perhaps has influenced the way that you conduct. You said it influenced you as a scholar and as a researcher. So kind of moving forward, you're taking what you've learned as part of this process into, and also the way that we all write about.
Yeah, it's really, I think what it's done is challenged me to think about how to bring my everyday self into my scholarly voice. And in presenting this material from the new book, where I really have been trying to do that in a very active way, and it's made the book take so much longer than I wanted it to. I just felt the title was ironic, Undead. I was like, this book is never going to end.
Yeah.
But people kept saying it's so human.
You said at the beginning, that need for kind of cold distance objectivity, which let's not jettison entirely because it's a really important kind of virtue of scholarship. But I think the emotion is probably, we need to be human as well as
that's
the
right.
figures, right?
And not unapproachable, and to invite people to come and talk to us, especially at this moment where universities, like in the country where I teach, are so under attack.
Sure.
That it's to let people know we want to be in dialogue with communities about what we're thinking and doing.
So just to shamelessly move to plug mode after all that wonderful sincerity. So this is a case study in your book, Undead, is it?
Yes, that's right.
So just give us a little bit more about what that wider book is about, because that's just come out May 2025. So it's been out for about.
And open access. I remember.
It's open.
Yes,
so you can. This book is free.
Yeah.
There are embedded clips. So some of these hard to find, more experimental animation things, you can just watch them online, or if you get the paper book, there are QR codes, so you can just scan it and watch it on your phone, which is fun. I've never had that chance before. The book, really is trying to think about what happens at the crossroads of feminism and animation, and why. I look at a lot of artists who don't consider. Helen Hill is one of the few people who identifies as an animator that I write about. Most of the other people do not identify as animators, but they turn to animation at certain moments in reflecting on war and war memory and living in the wake of war. Mariam Mahaje, who I'm going to interview today, is an image from her film Red Dress No Straps is on the front cover. She's one of the other people who identifies as an animator, but most of the other people just turn to a very kind of basic form of animation to do something. And I'm interested in what they're doing in the midst of an installation, a live action film, a loop installed in a museum. Like, what is animation doing in all these different places, and how does it help us to think about the place of war in our lives and what we could do to reduce the space that war takes up.
Yeah. Wow.
Amazing. Yeah. Karen, thank you so much.
Yes,
for coming
thank
on the
you
show and
for-
sharing Helen's work with us. It was a pleasure.
What a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for having me, and thanks for listening.
I feel really dirty doing this now, but I'm sure Helen would really not like this bit. But right, so if you want to find out more, you can go to fancy-animation.org, sponsored by Squarespace. It's not sponsored by Squarespace. You can find us on social media at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. Let us know what you thought of her work. Take part of the conversation there. You can also use that same handle, that's FANANIM Research at gmail.com. And you can email us suggestions for future episodes or footnotes. Until then, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
See people